Welcome back, everybody. Please click on Follow Presenter, and let's move on to the next lesson, which is utilize advanced user parameter techniques. So we're going to take a bit of a closer look at published parameters, private parameters, and required parameters. So in a workspace, let's say you were using a bufferer transformer. You knew that you're going to use the bufferer repeatedly. And perhaps in the buffer, the way which it does things would have to be standardized throughout the entire workspace, say the NCAP style, but maybe it varies from time to time. So I can create a user parameter from that. So now I have that user parameter. And if I duplicate this transformer, I have multiple bufferers that are all using the same parameter settings. So then if I need to change that, I have this one location where I can change that NCAP style. And then that will be applied to all of these transformers. Naturally, this is something which I don't want the end user to play around with. So that's why this is then set as an unpublished user parameter. Historically, we called these private parameters. That still floats around a little bit in the documentation. If you see private parameter, what that really means is an unpublished user parameter. So I find that quite handy if I need to reuse something repeatedly. Now, this does bring up the question, where am I using this particular parameter? If I right click here, there's an option called Show References. Basically, we're turning on this ability for this particular parameter. This can be done parameter by parameter. So then you can see where this particular parameter is referenced. So here I can see that this source data set, that's referenced once. The source data set's another one you can reuse. I've had workspaces where I'm reading in the same data set multiple times in multiple different readers because each reader had a slightly different configuration. And here we can see where our parameter is being referenced. Another thing which you can do with the parameters is make use of other parameters. So you could have a number of unpublished parameters. Let's see, is it the unpublished? No, you'd have a series of published parameters where people can set things. And then having an unpublished user parameter, you could bring all of that together. I'll just show you that directly in the manual here, as opposed to constructing it for you. So I would have my user parameters here. I have a username, Mark. I have an output folder, which you select, and I want to put those together. So it would be FME data resources / Mark would end up being the ultimate folder name. And in the parameters, I could either do this directly, or I could create another unpublished parameter that puts it together and then reference that. You could do it either way. You can make use of these parameters. It's this little $sign and then the name of the parameter. So I can make use of these and concatenate them together. If you wanted to get really fancy, earlier, I believe it was Mark asking about if we're going to cover Python scripted parameters. This is as far as we go. We just mentioned that, yes, they do exist. So you can, in a user parameter, introduce a Python or TCL script. TCL is the TCL or Tickle scripting language. It was a competitor to Python 20 some odd years ago. As far as I know, it pretty much completely failed. And now I believe most people just use Python. So with the parameter settings, the publish does allow the end user to see this parameter. Unpublished naturally doesn't. Now, if you are publishing to FME Flow, you're deploying this, keep in mind that you don't necessarily have to decide if something's going to be published or not at this point. I have a number of workspaces where I have a published parameter which I don't want the end user to use, but I want to be able to configure when I am in. So let's see if I go back here. Let's say I have this buffer distance. I create a workspace app from this workspace. I'll select the workspace food vendors. I have the parameter, but for me with the app, I want to be able to set that buffer distance. But I don't want the end user to see that I've changed that. So this is a published user parameter, which is an unpublished FME Flow app parameter. So this allows me to reuse this workspace in multiple apps, configuring it as I need it. And then the end user, they just see an app and it's automatically configured. I actually use this functionality quite often. So here's another example of the private parameters. This is something which is being concatenated together. So I have these published user parameters. I believe this is actually an old screenshot. I don't believe it actually shows up as private parameters anymore. Yes, so here you can see it just has a slightly different icon. It's not a separate section of the user parameters anymore. So you won't see it exactly like this with a private parameters. This is well, you might see this if you're using an older version of FME. And then if you're wondering what the difference is between a private parameter and an unpublished user parameter, there's no difference. They are the same thing. Here we can see we have our published user parameters prompting for a setting. And then here we have our unpublished parameter, which is concatenating all of that together. And then we are able to make use of that in another parameter. Another option is required or not required parameters. Sometimes there is a parameter setting which is not truly necessary for the workspace, or it can be run without it. So if you have something which you want people to be able to supply optionally and not be forced to do it, you do have to tell FME that this parameter is not required. By default, a published parameter will require a value be supplied. Here we can indicate it's not necessary to publish that, or not necessary to enter a value for that parameter. I should mention as well that there are conditional parameters as well that can check for certain values. And if this is true, give these parameters. If not, other parameters. Okay, so that is utilize advanced user parameters. So please review the lesson. We're at the top of the hour. So that's 10 minutes for that. Say another 10 minutes. So we'll continue for break. So please take a short break and we'll continue at 1220.